Well, thank you for spending a little bit of time after church. I know we love to hang out at church afterwards, sometimes noshing, but this time we have more edification than just food. So we will be hearing from Bernie Penner. He's a member of Zion. His father was actually a former pastor of Zion Lutheran Church, which is at City Hall. And he is the archivist. He knows a lot about the history. If you've ever been to their Christkindlmarkt, which is just before Christmas, it's usually the weekend after Thanksgiving, Bernie's the one giving a tour and talking about the history of the church. And so he seemed like the perfect person to ask to share with us on this, our 200th anniversary. So I'd just like to welcome Bernie Penner, and thank you for spending some time with us this morning.
Thank you, everyone. It was really nice to worship with you this morning. I came from Old Zion over to here and get my sources out for a minute.
Old Zion. Puppets, Bernie.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, I was actually thinking we'd be in the different room. So, so I don't know if you all can see the screen. It's not all that important, but I've got to kind of reach over and see if I can make my clicker work. So, anyway, Sandy, you're just sort of taping from the screen,
Yeah,
right?
we're just going to tape from the screen.
Okay.
We're saving this as an archive. We're trying to, whatever we learn about our history, we want to make sure we don't forget about our history.
Okay. Well, if you all can see me without turning your necks, I'll be running back and forth here. Anyhow, my name's Bernie Penner, and as Sandy said, I am a lifelong member of Zion Lutheran Church down the street across from City Hall. And I send you greetings from the people of Zion to the people of First English. Zion was founded in 1755. And it's right across the street from City Hall at the corner of Lexington and Holiday Street. And you're always welcome to come worship with us. We continue to have worship services in the German language. Today at 9:30, we had our worship service. We've got a reputation for being the old German church. And you all, First English, comes from us. Now, let's see. Doing this backwards is always a little bit of a challenge for me. Let's see here. Oh, just bear with me for a minute. The logistics of the space here.
Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Let me just see what I have to do. There we go. Okay. So there's Zion on the right and First English on the left. And we are Zion on the left and First English on the right. And we are two branches from the same vine. Founded in 1755, Zion was the host in 1809 of one of the first gatherings of the United Lutheran Church. There was Lutherans from New York to South Carolina, and as you know, Lutherans like to have synodical gatherings, and it was a long trip if you had to go from New York all the way to South Carolina or vice versa. Maryland was right in the middle, and so Zion was happy to found that. And as you're celebrating today in 1825, First English was formed from members of Old Zion. So this little piece of history I'm going to tell you first is our common history. And one interesting question is, why is First English, considered the first Lutheran church in Baltimore when Zion goes back to 1755? There are three salient factors to telling that story. First, religion, the faith of our fathers. Second, language, the mother tongue versus the language of the land we inhabit. And third, good old-fashioned egos. Every generation needs to leave its mark and be identified. So, let's look at the very beginnings. Maryland was an English colony. And that meant that all the good land, all the easy land to deal with, Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, you just had to drop seeds in the ground and stuff would grow, went all to the English Arichi. Right? The lords and ladies, that was like, they were sending colonists over, and they got all the good land. Baltimore was basically a swamp.
What?
You couldn't do much with it. There were three rivers, three major bodies of water coming in, the Jones Falls, the Gwynns Falls, and the Patapsco. And so you had to work it. Well, we have correspondence, there's correspondence on record at the Maryland Archives, that from Cecilius Calvert, where he writes to the Lords Baltimore, and he says, you know, we need to do something with Baltimore because it's potentially a great harbor, but we can't have anybody there to work it. So if we could get a few enterprising Germans to show up, they might be able to make a go of it. Why would the Germans want to be there? Well, one, Germany, let's see, I will advance to my next slide. There we go. Germany, as such, in those colonial days, didn't exist. Actually, what was in the place geographically of Germany was the Holy Roman Empire. So it was just a collection of principalities, ecclesiastical estates, all kinds of small little things. You can see there's a picture in that map. You can see there's all these little scribble-scrabble places, and they would elect an emperor. But the emperor wasn't like what we think of, somebody who's got complete control. The emperor was really just somebody who would ride around and settle disputes and had the ability to produce currency and things like that. So Cecil, the Calverts said, you know, if we can get some of these masters of small fortune to come over, they might be able to do something with it. And in Germany, they used the system of primogeniture. Does anyone know what that is? The oldest son inherits everything. So you had all of these second, third, and fourth sons who had skills, were doing things, but they were anxious to do something. So the New World was a place for them. But and there we have our old friend, Dr. Martin Luther. So the Germans who came to this area came from all different places. They weren't thinking of themselves as German. They were thinking of themselves as Bavarians or Saxons or all these different things. But as soon as they hit here, it was an English country. It was the travel across the ocean, all that was a fairly traumatizing experience. And they were so happy when they ran into fellow Germans. So that the Germans all sort of got together. And who do you follow? Whose belief do you follow? Well, it's Martin Luther. So even though, so what you had in Germany, of course, you had Catholics. There was all the fighting was going on between the Catholics and the Protestants. And all the various different sects. But when they came to the United States, they settled there in Baltimore. They identified with each other, and they all decided, we follow Martin Luther. And Martin Luther's, the principal document that those colonial guys had was the Augsburg Confession. Now that becomes very important. And they were carrying with them all of their religious texts. Yeah, Jane?
Maryland as a whole, though, was founded by Catholics, right?
Yes. Maryland, we were strangers in a strange land. We were sent to this small little place of Baltimore. There was all the Catholics. But Maryland was also known as the Free State. So it was very important that you could worship any way you wanted to. Lots of Germans went to Pennsylvania because there William Penn had that colony, and he was German. So the more German-friendly colony was Pennsylvania. But there was economic opportunity in Baltimore, and they were ready to take advantage of it. So, life in the New World in an English colony was not easy for the Germans. Their common bond was their language. Now, the German language, when you come into another country, I think this happens with lots of languages, but with the German language, it lasts basically 3 generations. You have the first generation that's speaking German, and that is their language, and they have to struggle with English. They can't read it, they can't do anything with it. Their children, who are born here, however, they pick up the English, and they associate English, and they're also easily speaking German because their parents were speaking German with them. So that's that second generation. I'm one of those. My parents came from Germany. I know German and I know English, so I'm relatively comfortable with it, although English is my mother language and German, I have to struggle a little bit with the German. But then by the time you get to the third generation, people aren't speaking German anymore. The pervasive pressure of the English language sort of took over. And the concept of being Lutheran is basically something that happened here in America. In Germany, you were either Protestant, Evangelical, or Catholic. You know, you follow the Pope, or are you a Protestant? But when they came over here, you know, all those little differences, all of the different Protestant groups basically called themselves, okay, we're Lutheran. But they did have differences of opinion. So what happened was, don't forget, it was an English colony, and so everybody had to pay a church tax. But the church tax went to the Anglican Church. And so the Germans were allowed first to worship in the oldest church in Baltimore, which is Old St. Paul's. And so the Anglicans allowed the Lutherans, in quotes, to worship together with them there at Old St. Paul's. And things went along fairly well until the year 1755. And in the year 1755, the Anglicans kicked the Germans out. Why did they kick the Germans out? Basically, 2 reasons. The first, our worship services were too rowdy. We sang too loud, we didn't follow things, we weren't sufficiently respectful. Secondly, our preachers were all drunkards. They were highly offended. Now, for the Germans, drinking beer on Sunday was like no big deal. Beer was what you drank. But for the Anglicans, for the English Arici, that was like, unacceptable. So, the Germans and religion was very important to people in those days, as opposed to now. It was like it held them together. It gave them strength and a sense of continuity. So the poor German congregation got kicked out, but they were fortunate because in that same year, this gentleman, Dr. Charles Wiesenthal, came to Baltimore. Now, why Wiesenthal didn't go to Philadelphia, we don't know, because most of the well-heeled Germans went to Philadelphia. Wiesenthal was in the army, was a physician in the army of Frederick the Great. And he was concerned about 2 things: good organized medicine and good organized religion. Wiesenthal is one of the founders of the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And this portrait hangs somewhere in one of their halls there, down on Green Street. So Wiesenthal, also concerned about religion, hits town and encounters this now scribble-scrabble group of all different Germans who have just been kicked out. And he says, okay, we're going to organize. And he got the Germans together. And over time, he was able to write to Henry Muhlenberg. Now, Henry Muhlenberg, I don't know, anyone familiar? I don't know. I always have this odd sense of how familiar are people with our Lutheran history. But Muhlenberg was a big deal for the Lutheran Church in America. Muhlenberg took it upon himself to import from Germany missionaries. He'd bring the missionaries over and he'd send them west. With the German communities and German settlers who were going perpetually out to the west. And the thing that was happening in the year 1755, though, was it became very dangerous to send people out west because of the French and Indian Wars. And there were all sorts of nasty stories about, settlers getting massacred and all that sort of thing. And, his precious missionaries were going out there and were risking their lives. And Wiesenthal says, look, we have enough Lutherans here in Baltimore that we could really support having a pastor come and visit us. Muhlenberg, happy not to send a man into harm's way, was happy to send a missionary pastor down to Zion, and 6 Sundays a year we could have Holy Communion. Now, the Lutheran Church is real finicky about when a congregation declares that it was founded. You have to have either a piece of land or some founding document. Why can Zion claim 1755? Because that's the year that Wiesenthal's letter, and still in the archives up in Philadelphia, I think it is, Wiesenthal's letter asking for somebody to be a pastor is acknowledged. So there was a little congregation put together, and they would meet in people's homes, and in 1760, let me bear with me for a minute. 1763, we purchased a chunk of land. The same chunk of land that we still have. From, Holiday and Lexington Street all the way around the block. Yes?
I was just wondering if that Muhlenberg is the same Muhlenberg that the college in Allentown.
It probably is. I mean, the name Muhlenberg was very pervasive, but yes, I bet the college was named after Henry Muhlenberg.
Because I think that college was affiliated with the Lutheran Church.
Yes, for the longest time. And there's statues to Henry Muhlenberg. There's a lot of them in Philadelphia, and he is a big deal. But the little congregation was able to buy a chunk of land, but on that piece of land, what they built, they didn't build a church. Why wouldn't they build a church? Because they were paying church tax to the Church of England. And they would be doggone if they were going to pay to build a church plus church tax. So they didn't call it a church. They built a little building, and that little building was a schoolhouse. And in that schoolhouse, they taught their children German. And it was just convenient that on a Sunday, they could get together and they could have their worship. Now, already, tensions were beginning to brew. And the tensions that were brewing were religious tensions. Because there were some Germans who took their German documents, and this is the Augsburg Confession. Auf Deutsch, the way the words are written. There were others who said, well, no, we don't quite believe that. They were a little more of a Methodist bent. They didn't quite accept all of Luther's teachings, but they were German and they were Lutheran. But the congregation, there was already starting to be a split here, and the split here was those who believed in the Augsburg Confession. Pay attention, now I'm telling you your family history. There was the Augsburg Confession. That's our team. And then there were the Reformed. So the Reformed and the Augsburg Confession group had a bit of a squabble, and they went off and bought their own chunk of land. And that gets to the other famous old church in Baltimore, Otterbein. Some people say, oh, Otterbein, that's the oldest church in Baltimore. And Otterbein is, in fact, an oldest church. But heretics that they were, they joined up with the Methodists. And so Otterbein was the pastor, but Otterbein is actually now affiliated with the Methodists. Now, in the year 1785, after the Revolution, and you can imagine in Maryland, there was most of the English who rich in Maryland did not want to leave the crown. This was dangerous stuff. But who really wanted independence? The Germans. And Baltimore was a going German town. And so following the Revolution, we no longer had to pay church tax, separation of church and state. And so they were able to consecrate their first little church. And there's a picture of it, a rendering of it. There wasn't much to Baltimore at that time. But that was the little church. There was plenty of Germans coming in now. Economically, things were difficult in Germany. Baltimore was a harbor, so ships came and landed in Baltimore. There were plenty of Germans in Baltimore, so Baltimore was a German town. There were also plenty of English, but there was a lot of Germans in Baltimore. And the congregation continued to grow and prosper, and actually it outgrew its present little structure. And so who they got as their pastor was Daniel Kurtz. Now, Daniel Kurtz is very important to our story. Daniel Kurtz, who's familiar with Lutherville? Okay, you all at First English should have a proud little space in your heart for Lutherville. And in Lutherville, there is a Kurtz Avenue. Now, he was the pastor of Zion from 1785, so they had their nice little new building, and it was growing. He was the pastor who raised the money and put the business together to build the big sanctuary that we now know as Zion, because there were sufficient number of Germans. And he was very involved in synodical work, and so one of the first conventions, it wasn't the actual consecrating convention, but of the gathering of the United Lutheran Church, which pulled together all of the good, solid Augsburg Confession Lutherans from New York to South Carolina, came and met at Zion in our big new building. And Zion was the host of it. We got a special communion set, which, by the way, we are still using to this day. And so there was the building. Now, this is the first time we also have recorded the name Zion. Zion always indicates a hill of some sort. Well, it doesn't look like it now anymore, but in those days, where Zion stands is the first high ground north of the harbor. So when ships would come in, they would see this big brick building, and the declaration was, "There stands the German Cathedral of Maryland." And all was well. But the seeds of discontent were brewing. In order to understand those seeds of discontent, we have to go back and take a little bit about what was going on in Europe in those days. What happened at the turn of the 19th century? The Enlightenment. Napoleon swept through Europe. And what was one of the first things Napoleon's great victory was? Over the Holy Roman Empire. Well, the Holy Roman Empire couldn't do much anyway. They had a hard time raising an army. I mean, it was just scribble-scrabble. Napoleon, in an organized way, with these new ideas of enlightenment, amongst not the least of which were divine right of kings is malarkey. Right? It is basically force that makes kings. There's that famous picture where Napoleon is crowning himself. So you had what was the Holy Roman Empire there on the left, shifted after Napoleon, and then Napoleon didn't last too long. He was defeated, so there was this North German Confederation. Suffice it to say, there was all kinds of political turmoil in Germany at that time. And in Germany, a very important event was the so-called Revolution of 1848. In 1848, a number of these little German states said, listen, look at the model of the United States. We can have a United States of Germany based on democracy, freedom, all of those beautiful Enlightenment ideas which we are trying to hold on to today in this country. But, those were the ideas. And they got together in Frankfurt, and they came up with a constitution and a master plan to have a United States of Germany. Unfortunately, Prussia, which did have a standing army, which was feeling its oats from the defeat of Napoleon, you sort of had Prussia and you had the Austrian Empire, and they said, now, it's time for Germany to have a nation. We will create an empire. And so the King of Prussia became the emperor of the First German Empire with Bismarck at its head. The Austrian Empire was sort of flickering. They had all these different languages, but the German Empire, these were all German-speaking people. And if you happen to be a democratic-thinking person, if you happen to think, well, no, we don't want to be under the rule of one man. We want to have some self-determination. you had one choice. Basically, get out or face death or roll over. So the free-thinking Germans got into boats and came to the United States in droves. So we're at the end of the old colonial period, the old Zion period, and now you had, and it was the biggest line going back and forth. The ships would go from Baltimore Harbor filled with tobacco. Rolling Road in Catonsville, we had tobacco. So our agricultural produce was rolled onto the ships, loaded in Baltimore. They'd sail off to Bremerhaven, where Maryland tobacco was very prized. And they would unload their tobacco, and they would load on German immigrants. And these folks would come over, and there was lots of German immigrants coming in. Since Baltimore was such a German town, of course, there was another wave of immigrants that was coming through at that time. Anyone want to guess who they are? And there's probably some of our blood here too. Another group. The Irish. Exactly. The potato famine was going on. So we had waves of the Italians and the Polish came a little later. During that time period, it was the Germans and the Irish. Now the poor Irish, they were set to work basically, they spoke English, they had basically no skills but their agricultural skills. They'd get off the boat and they would get put to work digging ditches and building railroads. But the Germans, they were political refugees. Intelligent people with skills, they'd get off the boats. The German merchants who were here would send agents down to the docks and would, go up to them. Sind Sie Deutsch? Sprichst du Deutsch? Ja, ich bin Deutsch. Ja, ich bin Deutsch. Was machst du denn? What's your trade? Oh, I'm a butcher. Oh, I'm a lawyer. Oh, I'm a doctor. We've got a job for you. And imagine the favor that did for the merchants who were here. They had a hungry, trained workforce that they could put into their businesses. So Baltimore was doing very well in this trade. Baltimore was doing well. Germans of Baltimore was doing well. So was Zion. But you had now the German community, which had been fairly homogeneous for over 100 years by this time, there were splits were starting to occur. And the one big split was between the free thinkers, the people who had fled the Enlightenment. I mean, Europe was all different. And the old, steady Germans, the traditional Germans. Who were the traditional Germans? The ones who had already been here. What did they believe in? They were Augsburg Confession. The other ones were like, that's old horse and buggy stuff. We don't want that. But they wanted to go to church, so there they were. Now the other split that was happening, painful split, was you now had third and fourth generation members who were going to this German church who didn't speak German. The problem was all the educational material, all the printed material was in German. Now, today, it feels very different because we got plenty of English translated stuff. But in those days, the Lutherans who wanted to, be Lutheran had to take the texts and translate them into English and then print them. And of course, the old line people would look at the translation, the people who couldn't read English, they had nothing to do with it. But the old strict people would look and say, that translation is wrong. And when you start messing with the words, you start messing with the faith. The other thing that was really deep in their hearts was the fact that the first translation of the Bible from Latin into a native-speaking language was Luther's. So Luther's Bible, the words of Luther's Bible, and now that was like 300-400 years earlier, was like sacred. Those words from God's lips to Luther's pen. That was the way they believed. And so you had within the Lutheran Church now these beginning splits. Or are you going to be pure traditional German, or were you going to be, and the movement was called bilingual. So the bilinguals and the traditionalists were struggling with each other. And you can't see my clever little thing. Poor Pastor Kurtz was in a very awkward position. He was bilingual. he was very active in the synod. The synod didn't take the synod long to look, see the writing on the wall here. Everybody's going English. Hanging on to German is kind of goofy. We have to begin to introduce the English language. So the further out churches, like in Frederick, Western Maryland, in Ohio, where we're having this constant wave of new immigrants coming in, they were going English. Kurtz was a synod man. Kurtz was very sympathetic to the desires of the English to be able to worship in their tongue. But he was also confronted with, every Sunday he was getting 50 new members who just spoke German. And there was a strong contingent in this congregation that said, Nur Deutsch. So then begins the sad saga, and I have brought sections that I could read, but I'll just keep it moving. You'll just have to take my word for it, but it comes from all of those various texts here. Begins the sad saga of the English-speaking members of Zion. Begin to hear the echoes of your grandparents now. The English-speaking members of Zion went to the council and said, can we please have just one Sunday a month where we can worship in English? And can we maybe use one text, one translated text? What did the Zion Council do? Ignored them. They just ignored them, acted like it didn't happen. They got frustrated. They tried again and again. Now Kurtz was getting old, and Kurtz was not doing anything really to discourage the English from doing their thing. And what was happening was the English who were here, and I think we can all empathize with this too, the English who were at Zion and wanted to worship in the tongue, they were like, this is dumb. We can't understand what's going on. We can't teach our kids what's going on. We're out of here. They left. The problem that they had when they left was they had to either go to the Presbyterians or the Methodists or the Anglicans. They could not stick with the faith of our fathers. So this was really starting to weigh heavily. And they finally, and again, I could read, it's actually rather colorful language. They printed a pamphlet. The English speakers printed a pamphlet where they begged the congregation to please let there be a little bit of bilingual worship. They bought a little bit of time because Daniel Kurtz was getting old. His nephew, Benjamin Kurtz, fluent English speaker, good man on theology, he was able to sort of bide the tide for a while. Benjamin Kurtz was in Zion and keeping people sort of happy and would occasionally have like outside the church worship service, no formal services. But Benjamin Kurtz, and everybody had high hopes that when Kurtz moves on, Benjamin would take over and we would finally, the English, who were about a third of the congregation at that time, the English were saying, finally, we will have a pastor. But then Benjamin Kurtz accepts a call to Hagerstown. And then the Zion Council did a somewhat shady, sleazy thing. I'm saying this the first English, the way the story was told is a little different. But, because remember, Kurtz now had these free thinking, he had a liberal branch, he had an English branch, he had the traditional German branch, and the congregation was growing and growing. He had a real mess on his hands. The German end of the congregation went out and found a liberal, free-thinking, bright pastor called Ullhorn, Johannes Ullhorn. He was a flashy dresser. He was also a man of science. He was also involved with the University of Maryland. And this is this guy's a gift from heaven. And they had a vote of the congregation, and Ullhorn failed, because of the English to some extent, failed to get the required 2/3 majority. And so the English portion of the congregation thought, okay, we'll just have to hold on and get somebody who's more to our liking. But Zion's council because the council didn't quite have the same representation of English, or for whatever reason, they sent Olhorn an official call to the pastor. Olhorn accepted. Olhorn came to Zion, and the English Congress basically violated the Constitution, overruled him, said, he's here now, we've got the contract, that's it. Olhorn is our man, he's our second pastor. Kurtz was like, there's letters back and forth how he was tried to keep the English there. But the English group said, we're done. You have betrayed us for the last time. And so they write to the Maryland Synod and says, we're asking for permission to have our own church where we can worship Augsburg Confession, but English language. The Synod said, sure, you can do that. So, let me see now if I move on to my next slide. This little house here. You guys have, by the way, a lovely church history. So the Synod gave them their blessing, and the Constitution was signed. That gives you all the year 1825, because your first building didn't come quite that early. But in 1825, you were able to have worship services in little households, and on the house it's a hustler house. Anyway, that's where First English had their first gatherings.
Where is that? Where is
I think that building is now gone. I think it was just up the street. It was up Lexington Street. And I believe my next slide. I've been here. Yes. So, First English had its Constitution adopted on December 21st, 1825, which is what gives you your 200 years. The building, which was on Lexington Street, that building, your first formal church building, was on Lexington Street between Paca and Utah, up there. It was a nice building. It was completed in 1826. It was consecrated in May of 1826. And then you had a little bit of struggle getting your first pastors together. But very shortly thereafter, you got a man fresh out of seminary, John Gottlieb Morris, who preached his first sermon here on December 17th. Everybody liked him, and he was ordained the pastor on February 23rd, 1827. And he's the one who I think you can legitimately claim as the first full-time powerhouse pastor of First English. And Reverend Dr. John Gottlieb Morris was a powerhouse. He was the pastor of your church right up to the beginning of the Civil War. He was strong in Lutheran doctrine. And if you were dealing with a Morris translation of old Augsburg texts, you were dealing with good stuff. This is the seminary development, cranking out and coming up with text and material. He was also remarkably a champion of women's education. He believed strongly that women also needed to be educated and brought along. And, notably, he was one of the founders of Lutherville. Now, yes?
There's also a Morris Avenue.
Yes, there's a Kurtz Avenue, there's a Morris Avenue, and so here's the story. It's a little bit off topic, but it's worth looking at. And if you go to the Lutherville Historical Society, Morris and First English is all like in there. The city, Baltimore, was pre-air conditioning days, but it was the beginning of rail transportation. So all the fairly well-heeled people, if they could, in the summertime, would get out of town and go north. Morris and one or two other associates, all good Lutherans, mind you, went and purchased a big chunk of land, now called Lutherville. They called it Lutherville, and they subdivided it. But the thing that Morris wanted to do, Seminary Avenue. What was at Seminary Avenue? Morris built a college for women. That college still stands, and a lot of it's a little ghostly thing. If you go into the chapel of that and now they're doing it for different things. I think it's an aged people's home now.
It
but-
is.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
nursing
college
home.
men. But you go into the chapel, and a number of the windows there are very reminiscent of the windows at Zion, the downstairs windows at Zion. It's almost clearly sort of done by the same guy. But anyhow, Morris in that group, and you had to be a good Lutheran to buy property in Lutherville. They were real restrictive about that. Only the right kind of people could go live in Lutherville, but there you have it. And the streets are all named after all these characters who were part of this story. So Morris Avenue is definitely after John Gottlieb Morris. And so slowly we turn.
Question, Bernie.
Yes.
Was that Morris guy? Is he more of like English ethnicity or German?
No, I think he was German. He was
German middle name.
He was a product. He was a product of Gettysburg Seminary. He was fluent in German. I mean, there was no question about his pedigree. He was definitely. We were all sort of that German stock, then becoming English. Now, poor old Pastor Kurtz. What happened? Flashback to Zion, and we're sort of landing the story, but all these pieces are important to our full, how interrelated and joined we are. Ulhorn, right, the free-thinking German pastor who the Zion's council slipped in under the door, Ulhorn goes back to Germany just for a visit, gets sick, and dies. So after all this turmoil, they thought they finally had it resolved. It wasn't resolved because Ulhorn had died. And it sort of started, the whole brew started stewing up all over again. Now, at Old Zion, a lot of you came to found First English, but the other good standard Augsburg, there were a few of the old people who stayed good believers in the Augsburg Confession. But by now, the numbers in Zion were growing and growing of these free thinkers. And these free thinkers went out and they got themselves this man, Heinrich Scheib. Now, Heinrich Scheib, and you can see his years 1835 to 1896. Scheib was a rationalist. Scheib was not Augsburg Confession. Scheib had trouble. So Scheib had trouble with two central tenets of our faith. One, the Trinity, and two, communion, believe it or not. Now, Benjamin Kurtz, Daniel Kurtz's nephew, very bright man, had begun publishing a publication called The Lutheran Observer, which was, for good Lutherans, and it was an English publication. And in The Lutheran Observer, Benjamin Kurtz takes Scheib completely to task. Scheib is wrong. They can't even call themselves Lutheran. They should be thrown out. Again, I've got some very colorful language that they make. They refer to Scheib and his gang of Unitarians. Now, the thing about Scheib was he was really packing them in. And if you were going to be old Augsburg Confession, there were all plenty of other little churches out there. I can hear it's noon. I'm wrapping it up. All these other little these churches out there. So Zion was really definitely out there, progressive, left wing. Scheib was not a Unitarian. He was a rationalist, not even. Now here's the difference that we draw. Unitarians believe that the Bible, although a wonderful piece of literature, a wise piece of work, but the Bible is not divinely inspired. The words do not come directly from God or his messenger. Scheib believed the Bible was divinely inspired. But where he differed was, he says, there's all this mumbo-jumbo that clergymen throw in that keep us in the dark, and we don't need all this mumbo-jumbo. Christ's words for a way of living, the idea of love, the idea of forgiveness, all those are fine ideas. But all the rest of it, all the magic, just doesn't make sense in this day and age for modern people. So Scheib believed that we are grounded in our faith through the Bible and our love for each other. But that does not mean we have to give up our common sense. We do not, if it comes to a battle between common sense and what some guru 400 years ago said it meant, we use your common sense. Scientific method. Scheip was a big believer in education. So Scheip built a school. And that school was a breakthrough in those days because there was virtually no public education. Scheip's school taught both German, which all the Germans said, yeah, that's good sense, teach them German. But Scheip also said English too. If they're going to be good citizens, they have to be able to speak the English language. We want the German for the tradition, but they have to learn the English language. And Scheip had enough power and sway that whoever didn't like it, they had to leave. Guess one of the people who left. Guess who left? And it's one of your original members. Kurtz. Kurtz, to the end of his day, communed with First English. He communed with First English because you all kept the true faith.
This is the elder Kurtz.
This is the elder Kurtz. Although I'm sure Benjamin Kurtz was, Benjamin Kurtz sort of had a, and if you sort of study Lutheran theology stuff, Benjamin Kurtz had a national reputation because of his newspaper. So Zion was kind of from New York to South Carolina identified as, ooh, those people are stinky. So Kurtz joins First English. Scheip gets a letter from the ministerium in 1839, so we've been there for about 4 years, a letter from the ministerium saying you have to appear before us to defend your teaching. Scheip thought that the Trinity was like too much mumbo-jumbo, too complicated. Why break things up? God is God. Why do you have to do this? And communion, he said, everybody knows you're kneeling there at the altar. This is bread and wine that you're putting in here. This business about it's the flesh and the blood. No, it's symbolic of. It's symbolic of we are creating a communion, but it does not have to be the blood and the blood and the flesh. Well, the Lutherans who were there at that time, no, that's heresy. Scheip goes to the congregation and says to them, you better start looking for a new pastor because I'm going to have to stand before the ministerium. I'm not going to change my views. They're not going to change theirs, so I'm going to get kicked out. Congregation said, now think who these people were. These weren't your forebears. These were now the free-thinking guys coming over. They said, wait a minute, pastor. We like you. We've gone through all kinds of crap from higher authorities, so before we make you submit to their inquisition, they will have to tell us what authority they have to tell us anything. That letter went to the Synod. It sits there like a big stinky flag in the Synod archive. And the Synod, the ministerium, that's what they were calling themselves then. The ministerium did what ministeriums do. Nothing. They just didn't answer. They just ignored it. And in the act of ignoring it, after 4 years, nothing changing, the ministerium struck Scheip's name from the roll. So whereas Zion could have been the first Lutheran church, we were now out, cast into outer darkness, and became known as, let's see here, my thing moves along nice. Anyway, I think I've got one future slide where we were at that point known as the German Lutheran Church, or Zion Independent Church, but more commonly in Baltimore it was known as Scheip's Church. And everybody who thought of Scheip's Church, what you thought of was the Scheip School. And everybody was sending their kids to the Scheip School. There was a couple of these parochial schools. Public education stunk. And Scheip wrote all kinds of letters and publications. He filled, he was pushing for a formation of an education department. And I mean, he was really pushing, saying, we as a country are going to collapse if we do not educate our young. He was really big on education. And a little flakier on religion. But so what happened then was, there was this struggle. We go into the next half of the century between two giant intellectuals, Morris and Scheib. And so there was a period of time when the people of Zion would hear the name First English and go, and the First English people would say Zion, right? It was just a significant half of a century where there was definite strife. So Scheib was officially removed in 1839. The congregation fashioned itself as the German Lutheran Church, Scheib's church. And then in 1840, there was a fire at Zion. And the fire completely gutted the interior of the church. The church did not look then like it does today. Scheib was able to rebuild the interior of Zion to suit his theology. So we're a bit of a curio inside. And I invite you, won't do it today, invite you, if you ever want to come to Zion and get a tour of the interior, and I'll show you some of the things that he did to the inside of the church that made it look different. And that there's the symbol that they used. It's hard to see on the slide, but it's the German Lutheran Church, was the way we like to refer to ourselves. The Lutherans said, no, you're not Lutheran. But we said, we're German. And so, because we stuck with the language of God, don't you know? Yeah. Right. So, it was an interesting time. So, that's how you all were formed. And in the annals, when the Synod wrote its 100-year history, the first Lutheran church in the area, the original Baltimore Lutheran Church, was First English Lutheran. So you have a great distinction, and it was okay to be considered that because one of the George Washingtons of the Lutherans, Kurtz, came to First English because you stuck with the true faith. You messed with the language, which everybody was doing. You stuck with the true faith. Now, this weird situation then actually inured to Zion's benefit. The next pastors were again traditional Lutherans. tried to reel us back from this rationalist stand. When the First World War happened, the Lutheran churches that were still using German gave it up because we were it was the language of the enemy. There were a few synods, Missouri Synod held on to it. There were a few diehards, but they were further out. In Baltimore, you had a hard time getting Protestant German worship. Now, the interesting story with the Catholics, there were lots of German Catholics in Baltimore. And they begged and begged and begged, can't we have a German Catholic church? Can't we have a church? The Cardinal and the Catholic Church said, nope, one language, unified Latin. So the Catholics never got German because they had to do the Latin Mass. But so what happened was, Zion, having been outcast for so long and having been so strongly, we would continually, because I think it's because Baltimore was a port of entry, we were continually getting new waves of that first generation Germans who really couldn't speak the English language. And so it was very comforting to them to be able to worship in German and have their texts in German. Zion did not give up German. So what happened was, whereas the war was a bane to most German culture basically went underground in the 20th century, or the first part of the 20th century. It was a boom to Zion because if you wanted to worship in German, Zion was the only show in town. So once again, Zion became the German church. And believe it or not, it was not until 1947 that the first English services were introduced at Zion. And that was due to the pressure of the Second World War. Every Sunday during the Second World War, there were 2 FBI agents who were stationed at Zion because they were so sure we were a place where they were swapping spy stories. It was not until 1953. It was not until 1953 that Zion was asked to be readmitted to the Synod. And it was just before our 200th, you're celebrating that too, just before our 200th anniversary, which was 1955, we commissioned a history book. And this history book, you read it closely, is basically an apology to the Synod for our years of heresy. And they sort of basically said Scheich was kind of on the wrong beam, but he was good for the membership. And what forced us back, and then this is the last piece of the Zion story, what forced us back actually was, we had a good pastor, Zion's pastors would stay for a long, long time. Pastor Evers needed to retire. They needed a new pastor. And of course, Germany, historically, church was morphed by Hitler. Hitler had created this thing called the German Christian Church, sort of the beginnings of Christian nationalism. I mean, it was like, swastikas were hung in the churches. And there were a few brave Lutheran clergymen, Dietrich Bonhoeffer being the most famous, who stood up to Hitler and said, no, we're not going to do this. And Bonhoeffer gets killed, gets taken to the concentration camp. They also say that Bonhoeffer participated in a plot to assassinate Hitler. That was one of the reasons they were able to kill him. But he created a little seminary while Nazi Germany was going on. It was called the Confessing Church. It was a remarkable set of documents, The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But anyhow, the Confessing Christian Church. And one of the pastors of that Confessing Christian Church was a pastor by the name of Leopold Bernhardt. Dynamic preacher, bright man, brave man, came over to the United States, and Zion said, you, we want you. They made him a nice financial offer because the church was still doing very well in those days. The churches that were able to support these big structures, things are different now, but in those days, Zion was still doing very well. And they made him an offer, and Bernhardt said, only on 2 conditions do I take a call to this church. One, you open up your gates to the neighborhood, because Zion being downtown was all black neighborhoods around, and the Germans were white people in their little enclave. He said, you have to open up the doors and create a social contract with your neighborhood. And 2, you have to rejoin the Synod. But they needed a pastor. So they commissioned the writing of this very excellent history book, which is, again, an apology. But Zion really does not become part of the Lutheran Church until 1953. So you all are the oldest church. And with that, there you are. Proud to say, First English Lutheran, 200 years of service, 1825 to 2025. So thank you for your attention.